The familiar smell of stale tobacco and ozone always preceded him, arriving just seconds before the temperature in the room plummeted enough to turn my breath into ghostly white plumes against the dark. I was awake before he even spoke, lying rigid on the lumpy mattress of the Poprat apartment, my eyes fixed on the shadows pooling near the threshold of the bedroom. When he finally materialized, leaning against the doorframe with that casual, slouching posture I had known since childhood, my mind initially refused to process the impossibility of the scene. He wore the oversized, faded maroon hoodie from our high school graduation, the white cracked lettering of class of '09 barely legible across his chest, draped over a frame that looked hollowed out by years of hard living and bad choices. "Welcome back home, Sam," he said, his voice carrying the faint, raspy wheeze that had defined his late 20s, sounding entirely too casual for a man whose body was currently resting on a refrigerated slab 3 miles away. I sat up slowly, pulling the thin quilt to my chin as a delayed wave of primal dread rippled through the back of my mind, though it failed to paralyze me the way a proper nightmare should. "Hi," I managed to croak out, my throat dry from the sudden, Arctic chill that had settled over the bedroom, frosting the edges of the single window pane. He took a slow, measured step forward, his sneakers making no sound against the aging laminate flooring, moving with an eerie, weightless fluidity that betrayed his lack of substance. The moonlight cut across the room, illuminating his face in harsh silver relief. His cheeks were deeply sunken, his nose sat crooked from a long-forgotten bar brawl, and his skin bore the translucent, waxy pallor of early frost. "So what brings the big city progger back to our sleepy little valley?" he asked, tilting his head with a crooked, knowing smirk. "Visiting the old aunts, or did someone finally kick the bucket?" I stared at him, my lips parting in a vain attempt to form a sentence, the sheer absurdity of the question trapping the words in my chest. Stefan let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed hollowly off the plaster walls, throwing his head back in a pantomime of genuine amusement. "I'm messing with you, cousin," he chuckled, waving a dismissive hand through the freezing air. "I appreciate you making the trip out here, honestly. Just wish the reunion was happening under better circumstances, you know?" He took another soundless stride toward the center of the room, his eyes scanning the minimalist, IKEA-furnished decor with mild distaste before reaching into the pocket of his gray sweatpants. He produced a crumpled, familiar blue pack of local cigarettes, tapping the carton against his palm until a single white cylinder slid free. "Nice Airbnb setup," he noted, gesturing toward the sterile walls. "They have a strict no-smoking policy in this place? Does it really matter at this point?" I asked, my voice finally finding a steady, albeit hushed register in the cold room. Stefan grinned wider, revealing a dental landscape ravaged by years of neglect. Several bicuspids were missing, and the remaining teeth were stained a dull, unhealthy yellow. Yet he wore the imperfection with his trademark bulletproof confidence. He brought a battered brass lighter to his face, the brief spark of flame casting deep, dancing shadows across his hollow eye sockets, before taking a long deep draw and extending the pack toward the bed. When I shook my head and told him I had kicked the habit 5 years ago, he nodded approvingly, exhaling a thick, roiling cloud of gray smoke that lingered in the stagnant air far longer than physical smoke ever should. "Good on you, man," he murmured, his voice softening as he watched the vapor curl toward the ceiling. "I tried to quit a dozen times, but I never made it past the 48-hour mark. Addictive personality, you know how it runs in our blood." "How?" I paused, swallowing hard against the bitter smell of burnt plastic and old ash that seemed to radiate from his clothes. "How are you feeling, Stefan?" For a fraction of a second, the charming, self-deprecating facade slipped away entirely, and his countenance hardened into a mask of profound, unimaginable exhaustion, his eyes reflecting a deep, bottomless emptiness that made my heart stammer. Just as quickly, the easy smile returned, snapping back into place like a well-rehearsed magic trick. "Dead, obviously," he said dryly. "But honestly, the great beyond isn't half bad. It's real bright, super tranquil. Lots of golden light and little cherubs floating around playing harps and all that classic postcard stuff." I nodded slowly, watching another puff of condensation escape my lips, and murmured that I was sorry for how things had ended for him. "Don't sweat it," he replied lightly, turning his back to me and sauntering over to the frosted window to gaze out at the empty, amber-lit street below. I went out on a high note. A really, really high note. He stood in silence for a moment, flicking an ash that never hit the sill, before his posture shifted slightly, the casual indifference melting into something uncomfortably eager. "Is Anna making the trip?" he asked quietly, his breath fogging the glass without leaving moisture. I tightened my grip on the quilt, feeling a protective pang in my chest at the mention of her name, and confirmed that her flight from London was scheduled to land the following morning. Stefan nodded slowly, his fingers tracing an invisible pattern on the cold pane. "She ever get married?" he inquired, his tone deceptively neutral. When I told him I didn't think she had, he let out a low, thoughtful hum, abandoning the window to wander toward the wooden chair where I had tossed my clothes before bed. Before I could object, his pale, long fingers dipped into the pocket of my trousers, deftly extracting my worn leather wallet and flipping it open with practiced familiarity. "What about you, big guy?" he asked, completely ignoring my protests as he rifled through my cards. "Wife, kids. Sorry I haven't kept up with the family gossip lately. I've been tied up with my own drama." "No wife, no kids," I said, watching with a bizarre, paralyzed fascination as his translucent thumb traced the embossed lettering on my credit cards. "There was a girl in Prague I was serious about for a couple of years, but we drifted apart. I'm flying solo." Stefan didn't offer any relationship advice. His attention had caught on a small, laminated green card tucked into the clear window of the fold. "An organ donor," he read aloud, his voice dripping with dry irony. "Neat. Very civic-minded of you, Sam." In that quiet moment, watching my deceased cousin casually inventory my personal effects in the dead of night, the last remnants of my initial terror evaporated, replaced by a profound, heavy sadness. I realized with absolute clarity that he was simply a lingering echo of the boy I had grown up with, stripped of any power to cause physical harm, forever trapped in the nervous, searching habits that had consumed his final years on Earth. "Hey," he said, turning back toward the bed and holding my wallet open in one palm while his other hand hovered over the billfold. "Could you do me a solid and let me borrow 20 euros? I blinked, completely thrown off balance by the mundane request, and asked him what a spirit residing in eternal paradise could possibly need with European paper currency. Stefan's brow furrowed deeply, the playful glint vanishing from his eyes to reveal a face aged by centuries of weariness, his lower lip trembling slightly before he caught himself. "Look, the afterlife is great really," he muttered, his eyes darting away from mine to scan the dark corners of the bedroom. "The harps, the peaceful clouds, all of it is top tier. I could really use a little cash right now, okay?" When I pushed back, gently asking again what the money was actually for, his shoulders slumped in. "Resignation. Does it really matter at this point, Sam?" he whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate, familiar vulnerability that I had heard 100 times over the phone during his bad months. "I guess it doesn't," I sighed, letting my head fall back against the pillow. With a swift, practiced motion that made my stomach turn, Stefan reached into the leather fold, pinched a crisp blue 20-euro note between his fingers, and smoothly slipped it into the front pocket of his maroon hoodie before tossing the wallet back onto my folded trousers. "Thanks, Sam," he said, his posture instantly brightening as he retreated toward the bedroom doorway, his form beginning to thin and bleed into the surrounding shadows. "I owe you one. I'll catch up with you soon." Before I could open my mouth to demand an explanation or bid him farewell, my eyes blinked shut against a sudden flash of silver light, and I woke instantly to the muffled sound of morning traffic outside and a room flooded with dull, gray overcast daylight. The freezing cold had completely dissipated, the lingering stench of burnt plastic and old sweat was gone without a trace, but as I sat up on the edge of the mattress, my tongue felt dry, and I was struck by a violent, physical craving for a cigarette. 2 hours later, I stood near the arrival gates of the Poprad-Tatry airport, watching the small stream of passengers disembarking from the London flight through the glass partition. When Anna stepped into the terminal, pulling a battered carry-on bag behind her, my chest tightened with a sudden, overwhelming rush of affection and nostalgia that caught me entirely off guard. We embraced in the middle of the concourse, holding each other a second longer than mere old friends usually do, our initial greetings marked by that strange, giddy relief that comes from seeing a face you once loved aged by a decade of separate experiences. Her hair was cut shorter than I remembered, framing features that had matured from girlhood sharpness into a warm, striking elegance, yet the moment she smiled, her nose scrunched up in the exact same way it had when we were 16. For the first 20 minutes as we navigated the baggage claim and hailed a taxi at the curb, we managed to keep the conversation light, deliberately dancing around the somber reason for our reunion with polite questions about flights and careers. Once we were seated in the back of the taxi, watching the gray, industrial outskirts of our hometown roll past the window, the fragile bubble of casual pleasantries popped, and the heavy reality of Stefan's death settled into the cramped cabin. Anna's gaze drifted to the window, her shoulders sinking into the upholstery, and within seconds, I saw her lower lip tremble as thick, heavy tears welled in her eyes and began tracing silent paths down her cheeks. "I had a terrible dream about him on the flight over," she whispered. Her voice choked and ragged as she wiped at her chin with the sleeve of her coat. "I haven't slept a solid hour since Aunt Viera called me with the news last week, but the second I drifted off somewhere over Germany, he was just sitting there in the empty seat next to me, just staring at me and chain-smoking those awful local cigarettes." My hand instinctively twitched toward my coat pocket, where my wallet sat noticeably lighter than it had been the afternoon before, a chilling confirmation hovering on the tip of my tongue, but I swallowed the words down. Instead, I slid across the vinyl seat, stretched the seatbelt as far as it would give, and wrapped my arm firmly around her shoulders, holding her close while the taxi driver tactfully turned up the volume on the local radio station to mask her weeping. We had both received standing invitations to join the extended family for a heavy lunch at Aunt Viera's apartment, but by the time we dropped Anna's luggage off at the Airbnb, neither of us possessed the emotional stamina required to face a room full of grieving relatives. Citing a desperate need for fresh air after her flight, Anna suggested we take a walk, and we instinctively drifted toward the old train station park, a overgrown municipal square where the three of us had spent countless afternoons after the school bell rang. The park had degraded over the last decade, its benches now occupied by watchful vagrants and the pathways littered with damp autumn leaves. Yet the layout remained a physical blueprint of our youth. As we walked slowly along the cracked asphalt, our hands brushing occasionally between us, we traded the minutiae of our adult lives. She described the relentless pace of her marketing job in London, while I talked about the quiet, predictable routine of translating financial documents in Prague, both of us marveling at how far we had traveled from this foggy valley. We eventually settled onto a weathered wooden bench near the rusted remains of a fountain, letting the conversation drift naturally back to the golden summer of our 6th grade year, before the world had grown complicated and dark. We laughed about our disastrous high school prom, recalling with vivid clarity how Stefan had smuggled a bottle of cheap apricot brandy under his coat, leading to an evening of spectacular, spinning sickness behind the gymnasium. We reminisced about the humid July night we had squeezed through the chain-link fence of the municipal water park, swimming under the stars until Anna's elderly neighbor, who was supposed to be watching her while her parents were away, nearly fell asleep in the lounge chairs and had to be bribed with pastry to keep our secret. We would literally end up in the emergency room if we drank half as much as we did back then, Anna laughed, wiping a fresh tear from her eye that wasn't born of sadness. She fell silent for a long moment, running her palm over the rough, peeling green paint of the bench slats, before looking up at me with soft, searching eyes. "Do you remember this exact spot, Sam?" I looked down at the graffitied wood, searching my memory banks, and admitted that the specific benches had all blurred together over the years. "This is where we smoked our first cigarette," she said softly, a wistful smile touching her lips. "Summer before 7th grade. The three of us pooled our lunch money and bought a blue pack of Elenemus off that older kid who worked at the kiosk. We sat right here, coughing our lungs out, thinking we were the absolute kings of the world." The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow, instantly stripping away 15 years of adult weariness. For one brief, magical second, I could feel the late afternoon sun on my neck, hear Stefan's boisterous, unbroken laughter, and taste the bitter, dizzying rush of cheap tobacco on my tongue. Before the nostalgia could fade, Anna reached into her coat pocket and produced a fresh, blue pack of Elenemus, tapping it against her knee and offering the open box to me. "I thought you quit years ago," I said, eyeing the unfamiliar health warnings printed across the modern packaging. She shrugged weakly, pulling a lighter from her pocket. "I did. Kicked it completely the year I moved to the UK. Then Aunt Viera called on Saturday, and I bought a carton before I even packed my suitcase." I stood at a crossroads for 3 seconds, weighing 5 years of clean lungs against the heavy, ghost-haunted air of my hometown, before reaching out and sliding a white cylinder from the pack. I rationalized the relapse as a necessary ritual, a liquid libation poured out over a grave that had not yet been dug, a silent communion with the boy who had defined both of our childhoods. The paper felt different between my fingers, the chemical composition of the tobacco had clearly changed over the decade. Yet the moment the flame caught and the bitter smoke filled my chest, the familiar rush anchored me deeply to the present. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the gray smoke rise into the autumn canopy, before Anna let out a long, shuddering sigh and leaned her head against my shoulder. "Sam," she whispered, her voice dropping so low I could barely hear her over the rustling leaves. "I really don't think I have the strength to see her tomorrow." I didn't need to ask who she meant. Aunt Viera had always been a force of nature, a woman whose overwhelming personality could suck the oxygen out of an auditorium. "She was relentless after I moved to London," Anna continued, her fingers twisting the empty cigarette wrapper in her lap. "She would call me at work on weekends late at night. Oh Anna, Stefan is a mess without you. His apartment is a disaster. When are you coming back to your senses and coming home?" I must have explained to her 20 times that we were completely broken up, that we had toxic habits we couldn't break together. But she just refused to hear it. She still called me at least twice a year just to guilt-trip me.